don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. Someone's wrong on the internet, don't you know?
So our next speaker is going to be talking about pseudoarchaeology. Kurly Tlapoyawa, he's the host of a podcast called Tales from Atlantis, which is better than this kid. He is a longtime friend of mine. He's a super cool guy. He's a filmmaker. He's a podcaster. He's a consultant for Nickelodeon. He's a former stuntman.
Just the main screen.
2 weeks ago, he was
Awesome.
being eaten alive by mosquitoes
Check.
in the Central American jungle, which is pretty cool.
That's cool.
I've been there. I've done it. So, Kurly, take it away.
It kind of sucked. All right. So my name is Kurly Tlapoyawa. I'm an archaeologist. I'm a cultural anthropologist, ethnohistorian. I'm a filmmaker, author, and I work as a cultural consultant for Nickelodeon Animation Studios. And I'm also the co-host of the Tales from Atlantis podcast, where we examine pseudoarchaeology, pseudo-history as it relates to Mesoamerica, the Mexican-American community, Mexico. And we try to focus mainly on that, but we also include topics that we feel are relevant to our community. But my co-host, Dr. Ruben Arellano Tlacateca, is a professor of history, and I'm the archaeologist. So if you want to check us out, I ask that you do so at Tales from Atlantis. So today I want to talk about, this talk is called Course Correction, how pseudo-history, pseudo-archaeology, and conspiracy theories undermine the goals of ethnic studies. And I say this as somebody who has taught ethnic studies classes. I work as a cultural consultant. I've written books. I'm a product of the Chicano movement. So Chicano studies has had a huge impact on my life, and I see value in teaching the history of my people. But what I see sometimes is pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology, conspiracy theory can make its way into these programs and affect how they're being taught. And I feel that this undermines the intent, the goals of ethnic studies. It takes away from the value that they can be given to people. And I want to start with this idea here. I don't know if you've ever seen this symbol right here. It's pretty popular. If you read this slide, it says the philosophical foundation, right? Inlach'ech, Panchebe, and Hunabku. So of these three concepts, I want to talk about this, Hunabku, and as it relates to this symbol right here. The symbol is very, very popular in Chicano communities, in Mexican-American communities, and in Mexico as well. You'll see this symbol all over the place, and it turns out that the symbol has a rather interesting history behind it, and also how it relates to this idea of Hunabku, which these slides are from a Chicano studies class, and the way that they defined Hunabku is as movement and measure, the name the Maya gave to the equivalence of the supreme being or the grand architect of the universe. If that sounds very Freemasonry, it's because a lot of it is connected to Freemasons from the 1800s and the influence that they had on Mexico and Central America. This idea, this is from a website called Dissident Voice, and this individual, Roberto Rodriguez, he's a friend, he's passed away recently, but we were friends. We disagreed on a lot of things, but we maintained our friendship. And he was a big proponent of this style of teaching. So this is an article he wrote called Inlach'ech, Panchebe, and Hunabku, the philosophical foundation for Raza studies or Chicano studies. And so this idea that these allegedly Maya concepts were the philosophical foundations for these classes is something that I want to get into. So if you've never looked up the image, if you Google Hunabku under Google Images, you'll get this wide variety of representations of it, right? Some of them are made to look more So you see more Mesoamerican-ish depictions of this alleged Maya symbol. You see it as tattoos, you see it on murals, you see this really awesome AI-generated image. But all of them say, right, the Mayan symbol for the creator, the enigmatic Hunabku, the Mayan god, Hunabku. And I can tell you this as an archaeologist. One of the main ways you could tell somebody is full of shit, doesn't know what they're talking about, is they use Mayan to describe the people. The people are Maya. The language is Mayan. And this is one thing that we learn right off the bat in archaeology. And so we could tell the hucksters immediately. And this symbol appears, here it is, on this cool mural. And it's a cool symbol. Like, I'm not going to deny that this isn't a very cool looking symbol. Some people get it tattooed on their bodies, making it like this indelible part of their existence. But where does this symbol come from, and what does it actually mean? And how is it tied to this idea of Hunabku? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to the Spanish invasion of Mexico. And when we look at the invasion of Mesoamerica by the Spaniards, we have to understand that the Catholics who were coming were tasked with the responsibility of converting the native people, right? But if you think about it, and you're encountering people who have an entirely different cosmovision, an entirely different worldview, an entirely different language than you do, how are you going to make your concepts clear to them? You don't even speak the same language. How are you going to explain the concept of the Holy Trinity? How are you going to explain the concept of, the blood of Christ, the body of Christ, if you don't even speak the same language? And these people have no idea. There's no words in their language that even closely equate to the ideas that you're trying to give them. So what you do is there's this great book, if you're interested. It's called Maya and the Age of the Cross. I can't recall the author right now, but he calls it Maya Reducido. And essentially, you need to invent words in the Maya language that transmit these ideas, right? So how are we going to get across the idea of a singular God, of a monotheistic God? There's no concept that exists in the Maya language for that. So you have to invent new words. So you start asking people, like, in your language, how would you approximate this idea? And they'll start telling you. I refer to this as the vocabulary of conquest, and I have some examples here. You had to invent new terms and expressions known as neologisms in the indigenous language that could adequately carry the necessary meanings, right? For example, in Nahuatl, the word of the language of the Aztecs or the Mexica, the words Teotlaxcali, which means sacred tortilla, literally a sacred tortilla, Teotlaxcali, or Istac Tlaxcaltzintli, which means tiny white tortilla. These were both invented terms used to identify the Eucharist. So you had to come up with new words to describe these ideas, right? And so one of the more notable examples of this practice comes from the invasion of the Yucatan, where the term Hunabku was invented by a Spanish friar named Antonio de Ciudad Real with the help of his Maya-speaking indigenous aides. Hunabku was invented for his Dictionary of Motul, and it was invented as a way to introduce the Maya to the idea of monotheism. And here's the page from the actual Diccionario de Motul, Hunabku, right here, and the definition: the only living and true God, which sounds very Catholic, right? Also, the greatest of the gods of the people of Yucatan. He had no form because they said he could not be represented as he was incorporeal. And we suspect that this was done because later Maya people would be like, well, if this God is so important, how come he's not represented in any of our codices, in any of our architecture, in any of our murals, in any of the stela? Why is there no existence of this idea of Hunabku? And the Catholic friars could say, well, I mean, he could not be represented, right? You know, didn't you know this? Your ancestors knew this, because Hunabku is obviously the only living and true God. Hunabku, this idea, was repopularized in the 1950s by this individual, Domingo Martinez Paredes, a native speaker of Yucateco and a professor at UNAM. In his book, Hunabku, Síntesis del Pensamiento Filosófico Maya, synthesis of the Maya philosophical thought, right? It's very new agey. He really pushed this idea as Hunabku as being the only giver of movement and measurement, which is, again, a very Freemason salute, a very Freemasony idea that he was picking up. Paredes used Hunabku to promote the idea that the Maya were monotheistic. And he was a member of an extreme nationalist organization called the Movimiento Confederado Restaurador de la Cultura de Anáhuac, or the MCRCA. And it was a very nationalistic group with the reputations for spreading pseudo-historical accounts of Mexico's indigenous history. So their idea was, we're going to elevate our people by saying, you know, we didn't believe in a lot of gods, that's for savages. We had one true God, and it was Hunabku, and we traveled across the ocean, and we taught this to the Egyptians, and we, you know, descended from Atlantis, and blah, 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 blah. Well, it turns out that Domingo Martinez Paredes was heavily influenced by the writings of a guy named Augustus Le Plongeon. And Augustus Le Plongeon was a French occultist and Freemason and archaeologist who went to Mexico, and he came up with a lot of these ideas. He wrote these insane books, and they're slogs. If you try to sit down and read one of his books, they're really, really hard to get through. But he came up with all of these ideas that were later basically cribbed by Domingo Martinez Paredes as like ancestral Maya knowledge, right? So this idea of Hunabku was invented by Catholic priests, and then it was repopularized in the 1960s by this individual right here. Then later, Hunabku underwent another transformation, thanks to this guy, New Age author and artist Jose Arguelles. In 1987, Arguelles published his book, The Mayan Factor. So once again, Mayan, it's like, you don't know what you're talking about. So this guy, on the cover of his book, the Maya, El Factor Maya, El Camino Más Allá de la Tecnología, threw this image on there, and he called it Hunabku. And it's a neat image, right? It looks sort of like the yin yang. You could see how people would be drawn to this image. Again, I'm not dogging on the image. I think it's kind of cool. But where did this image come from? And what does it actually mean? Well, the image isn't Maya at all. It is Mexica. And these are pages from the Codex Maglebeciano, where it is described as a manta de agua de araña, the mantle of the water spider, because the Spaniards thought it looked like a water spider. And then here it's described as a tilmat de sacat o besote del diablo, which means a libret of the devil. And that's because some of the Mexica deities were depicted wearing these nose pieces and lip piercings with this design on it. And so this is the actual image. It's from the Maglebeciano. A lot of people still argue over the actual meaning of this image, but we could notice a couple of things. It's not black and white, and it's not a circle. This is how it's depicted. So, how did it become black and white and get turned into a circle? Right. Basically, Arguelles thought if he turned it into a circle, it would look more like the yin yang, and that he could push this idea that it was part of this Maya identity. But we now know that it's not a Maya image at all, it's Mexica or Aztec. But how did it become black and white? For the longest time, I thought Arguelles turned it black and white to make it look more like the yin yang, like it made sense to me. But then I spoke to a friend of mine named Gordon Whitaker. And Gordon Whitaker is an epigrapher. He wrote this great book on deciphering Mexica glyphs. And the story that Jose Arguelles tells is that he was in the weaving communities in Teotitlan and Oaxaca, and he saw this image being sold in the marketplace on the blankets. And he's like, this image is beautiful. So he bought it and decided, well, this is going to be Hunapku. This is going to be the image that I promote as Hunapku. So Gordon was kind enough to send me an email. And I think this story is hilarious. He says, in the 1970s, I was preparing to write my dissertation for Yale, and I spent the summers of 1975 and 76 in the Valley of Oaxaca studying the inscriptions at Monte Alban. In my spare time and to supplement my work, I collected folk beliefs in Teotitlan that seemed to relate in some fashion to pre-Hispanic Zapotec culture. While there, I spent much time interviewing weavers and chatting with the people tending the stalls in the marketplace. When I returned in 1976, I brought with me my favorite Aztec design from the Codex Maglaveciano, which, that right there. I had used this image as a mural motif in my dorm room. I had turned the yellow and black original into black and white for my mural, because he just thought it looked cool. This was the design I gave to one of the weavers in Teotitlan. I paid him, and I would return to pick it up the following summer. Unfortunately, I was unable to return the following summer. And when I finally got back in 1978, I stopped in Oaxaca to discuss epigraphic matters. On a stroll through the market, I was surprised to see my adapted design on blankets being sold in the stalls at Teotitlan. So at the conference in Bonn, there was considerable amusement over the history of this motif and my part in it. On returning from the conference and while surfing cyberspace, I discovered that Jose Arguelles claims to have bought a blanket with this image on it in Teotitlan. So it became black and white, not because of Jose Arguelles, but because this, Gordon Whitaker painted a mural, turned it black and white. He had somebody weave it onto a blanket. And then the other weavers thought it was a cool design, so they made a bunch of blankets with this design on it. Jose Arguelles pops in, says, oh, this is awesome. He buys it, and then he started pushing it off as this ancient Maya symbol, right? So it's like this super convoluted sandwich of bullshit, right? You got the Catholic invention of the concept of Hunapku, and then you have this symbol that was taken by a New Age writer, but was actually invented by this other guy, and now it's showing up in Chicano studies classes as this legitimate idea. It's being taught. And people are getting it tattooed on their bodies and t-shirts and all of these things. Here's a photo that Gordon sent me. This is the actual mural from his dorm. This is the photo he took with him to Teotitlan to have the blanket made. And so we're able to track exactly where these ideas are coming from. And it's become so entrenched in some of these classrooms that when I bring this up, I'm seen as attacking the value of Chicano studies. And I'm like, no, I'm not attacking the value of these classes. I'm saying that my history is important enough to me to be told correctly. It doesn't need to be propped up with nonsense. It could stand on its own 2 feet. And we do our people a disservice when we teach them nonsense instead of teaching them their actual history. 1, and 2, the right, people on the right, have a hard-on for attacking ethnic studies classes, and we make it easier for them to attack and dismantle if they could point out that, well, you guys are just teaching bullshit. Anyway, you're not even teaching real history. It's nonsense. It's all this New Age stuff. So I'm not against DEI or ethnic studies or Chicano studies, African American studies. I'm just saying that it's worth teaching correctly. And so that brings me to my second point. On the podcast, a lot of people send us articles and videos, and they ask us, like, is there anything to this? Like, what is this? And so this paper was published in an academic journal called the Urban Review. And the paper is called Early Pioneers of the Americas, the Role of the Olmecs in Urban Education and Social Studies Curriculum. And so we're like, oh, okay, let's check it out. Let's look into this paper and see what's going on. And among the things this paper says is, this paper seeks to answer the following research question. What are the educational implications of the Olmecs and their civilization, the oldest in the Americas, not exactly, for social studies standards and curriculum development processes? So I was like, oh, okay, cool. They want to teach about ancient Mesoamericans and social studies. That's awesome. I'm down with that. So then I read more. This paper provides primary source documentation as it addresses the omission of the Olmecs in public school curricula. Fine. I'm totally fine with that opening statement. And then the paper goes on to say, over 3,000 years since their arrival, the Olmecs, early pioneers of the Americas, have left an indelible mark on La Venta, Mexico, where stone statues and step pyramids mark their pre-colonial presence. Period. Next sentence. Africans showed their brilliance as they utilized cutting-edge technology like those used to build pyramids when they applied their skills in shipbuilding, as well as their understanding of geography and trade winds to cross the Atlantic Ocean, which was originally called the Ethiopian Ocean, and created a civilization and culture in La Venta, Mexico, known as Olmec City. And I was like, what? The hell's going on here? While many distinct Olmec societies existed in the Americas, apparently there were more than one, they all shared unique cultural practices, distinctive African art forms, and language systems. Anthropological and archaeological research suggests that the original Olmecs were Africans who migrated to the Americas as early as 900 BCE and created a civilization in present-day La Venta, Mexico.
I'm sorry, this is in the paper, in the journal, or this is the course description?
This was a journal article that was published. So we were like, well, hold on. And if you read the paper, the purpose of the paper is to say, how can we teach this better in schools? Not whether, is any of this even accurate? Like, the starting position is that Black Africans came over to Mesoamerica and taught birthed civilization, taught the Mexicans, the ancient Mexicans, how to build pyramids, how to write, how to do this, how to do that. And we were like, well, hold on. None of this is even remotely accurate. So we responded. We wrote this open letter called Hijacking History, the problem with the Black Olmec myth. We published it to our Medium site, and then we converted our open letter into a script that we used for the podcast, and we covered it in a couple of episodes. This one directly about that article, the journal article, and then we followed it up a little bit later to see where things were standing presently. And we concluded our letter, like we weren't, like you were saying earlier, we weren't snarky, we weren't confrontational, we weren't saying, you guys are assholes. Like, we weren't going off like that. We just wrote a very well-reasoned letter to the journal saying, look, this is why you might want to reconsider this paper that you've already published, by the way, interestingly. And we finished by saying, we certainly agree that the history and legacy of African peoples in the Americas is still not sufficiently taught in schools. But we do children a disservice by advancing opinions as facts. Promoting the idea that the Olmec were black is more than simply poor scholarship. It is an erasure of the accomplishments of indigenous Mexicans. Africa and Mexico are both home to fascinating civilizations, each with their own advancements in technology, linguistics, agriculture, and science. When we embrace the pseudo-history of black Olmecs, we trivialize and marginalize the legacies of both Africans and indigenous Mexicans. So we wrote this letter, and the response we got online was generally, you guys are racists, you guys are, what are you talking about, you guys, and especially myself as an archaeologist, why are you hiding the truth? What are you afraid of? Why are you hiding these facts? But to our surprise, the journal retracted the paper. So here's the headline. Thank you. And we're still pretty proud of this. This is one of the best moments of the podcast, is that we got this paper retracted from this article. This article retracted from this journal. Journal retracts paper claiming that group of indigenous Americans were black Africans. And this is what was interesting, though. In the announcement, it says, the editor-in-chief has retracted this article following concerns raised by readers. After post-publication peer review, it was found that the theory that Olmecs were black Africans, it's not a theory, it's a hypothesis, anyway, on which the lesson plan is based is not substantiated according to current Mesoamerican archaeology and genetic evidence. The authors have been offered to submit a revised manuscript, updated with information based on current knowledge for further peer review. Author Greg Wiggins stated on behalf of all co-authors, they do not agree to this retraction. But it was that line right there, post-publication peer review, which kind of blew my mind. It's isn't that supposed to happen before? I don't know. So it makes me question everything else that this particular journal has published up to that point. I haven't looked through this journal since this, but it's a little bit sus. Unfortunately, so this happened in 2020, and we thought the matter was pretty much settled with these authors. Well, it wasn't so, because we found out in 2023 that they just published it anyway on their own as a chapter in a book that they wrote. And the book is called Unbleaching the Curriculum, Enhancing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Beyond in Schools and Society. And it's chapter 5. And basically they repurposed the article to work better as a chapter, but none of the content was substantially changed. None of the claims were readdressed. None of the science was reevaluated. It was just published claiming the same stuff. And this book is used in some classes, in ethnic studies classes. So still, there's a fight, right? There's still a struggle against this type of disinformation being introduced in classes. And we are not immune here in New Mexico, because my good old alma mater of UNM put out this class, and they've been running this class for about 10 years. And the class is called, it's their study abroad, exploring the African presence in Mexico, which is fine. There is an Afro-Mexican presence. It deserves to be examined. People should know about it. There's a history there that is legitimate. But what we see is, as part of ongoing efforts to build lasting academic ties with university and cultural centers in Mexico, Chicana and Chicano Studies has partnered with the Universidad Veracruz and Civil Association in Veracruz to sponsor a unique study abroad opportunity. This intercession trip explores the African presence in Mexico in 3 different epochs: Olmec, colonial slavery, and contemporary struggles of newly nationally recognized Afro-Mexican communities. Additionally, students will delve into Son Arocho, and meet cultural practitioners like Julio Carro and Manalo Zavala. So again, they're using in their promotional materials an Olmec head, and then they straight up say, you know, African presence in Mexico, starting with the Olmec. So this was at UNM. So once again, right, we spring into action. We get all these archaeologists and historians to write letters of concern to the university and say, why is this being taught at the school that I went to? Like, it makes me think twice about the value of my degree that I got from your university if you're teaching pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology. A lot of people got wind of this. It became kind of a pretty big deal at UNM. Once again, I was accused of being a racist, of being anti-Black, of being anti-ethnic studies. So instead, I even got a text from a friend of mine who was in a meeting, who's a professor at UNM. He sends me this text, excuse me. And he says, bro, I'm in a meeting right now. They're talking about you. And I'm like, why are they talking about me? They said they're trying to figure out the best way to frame you as somebody who is anti-Black. And I'm like, well, you're defending me, right? He's like, well, yeah, I got your back. You know, like, not everybody's going for it, but like, this is gonna be a problem. I can tell. And sure enough, I started getting some hate mail from students at UNM. So this caught the eye of Jason Colavito. I don't know if you all know who Jason Colavito is, but he wrote a piece about it. And he said, the University of New Mexico came under fire online from anthropologists, archaeologists, activists, and skeptics after a flyer, this one, for an upcoming study abroad trip sponsored by their Chicano Studies department caused outrage by promising to help students learn about the African presence in Mexico during Olmec times. It was the decision to follow the Afrocentric claim that Olmec society had an African component that set off alarm bells. So the way that the class was described, and I already showed this to you on the flyer, but once again, our trip explores African presence in Mexico from 3 different perspectives: Olmec, colonial slavery, and contemporary Afro-Mestizo communities. So this right here is the original description for the class that appeared on the UNM website. So after we wrote all these letters and this big, wave of concern happened, they revised this description to be much longer. And they say, we delve into the roots of Olmec culture and we examine all but a few of the colossal Olmec heads of Las Tuxtlas, La Venta, and San Lorenzo. Our purpose is not to claim that these heads reflect a pre-Columbian African presence, but to help our students understand how and why many people of African descent have come to revere these magnificent heads. Acknowledging concerns of anthropologists, it is important to note we do not claim that the Olmec are of African descent beyond the notion that all of humanity finds its origins in Africa. That's weird.
What does that mean?
Yeah. For more than a decade, we have allowed UNM students to view these magnificent works of art in person and visit with anthropologists in Mexico about their origins. And then this sentence: we discuss the visceral and often hostile response to Jose Melgar's and later Ivan van Sertima's suggestion that the Olmec reflect a pre-Columbian African presence. We make sure that our students know that research offers no credible evidence that proves a pre-Columbian connection to Africa. This seems highly disingenuous to me. And it also did to Jason Colavito, because he noted in his paper that there is, of course, this is from Jason, there is, of course, some irony in the Afrocentric acceptance of the idea that the Olmec stone heads represent Black Africans instead of actual Maya people of the region, whom they so clearly resemble. The original claim that the heads were of Africans was made in the 19th century as a racist argument that Native people of the Americas were so racially inferior that they even accepted Black Africans as their superiors, even though the Black Africans themselves were slaves of white Atlanteans. So that's where this idea stems from. Our good friend of skeptics all over, Ignatius Donnelly, in his book, The Antediluvian World, put forth this idea that the white Atlanteans showed up, they brought Black slaves, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas were so pathetic that they even accepted the Black slaves as their superiors, right? And he notes there's a lot to unpack. But it's interesting to see how defensive the trip organizers are in their discussion. It is implausible that they have spent 10 years visiting the Olmec's heads and explicitly stated that there was no evidence of an African presence in Mexico without really meaning it. Now they claim that their importance lies in how Afro-Mexicans have used American Afrocentric pseudoscience to create a false cultural history tied to indigenous Mexico. So we did manage to get them to change, at least on paper, the description of the class, of how they said they were going to present the class to students. But we don't know, because then COVID happened, and the class hasn't happened since. So we have no idea what their intentions actually were, and we won't until this study abroad program, if it ever does, happens again, and we're able to somehow find out if they're still teaching that, the Olmecs represented a Black African presence in the Americas. And I want to quote from Ignatius Donnelly, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, because he's the one who really put forth this idea to begin with. And what he said was, the features are unmistakably Negroid. As the Negroes have never been a seagoing race, the presence of these faces among the antiquities of Central America proves one of two things. Either the existence of a land connection between America and Africa via Atlantis, obviously, right? Duh. As revealed by the deep sea soundings of the Challenger, or commercial relations between America and Africa through the ships of the Atlanteans, or some other civilized race, whereby the Negroes were brought to America as slaves at a very remote epoch. So just the pure racism that lies at the heart of this idea, and then to see it picked up and promoted in journal articles and at the university that I went to as some sort of empowerment idea, right? Like African Americans should know about this because it shows this connection between their ancestors and Central. And if that were true, that would be amazing. I would have no problem with exploring that. But it's not true. It's rooted in racism. And these ideas, like I said, when they make their way into ethnic studies classes, into the classroom, into textbooks, it's a problem. And what we've found through the podcast is that a lot of professors, historians, anthropologists who are not people of color are afraid of addressing this stuff because the response, just like we got, the response was to call us racists, to call us anti-Black, to call us anti-ethnic studies. And this onslaught of attacks, a lot of people just don't want to deal with it. They're like, look, we know it's nonsense, but what am I going to do, right? There's nothing I can do about it. There was a mural that appeared in San Antonio about, it was a Juneteenth mural, so it highlighted African-American history. It was a beautiful mural, but smack dab in the center was an Olmec head. And we were like, come on, guys. So we spoke to the artist, and we spoke to historians in the area, and it's the same feedback we got from the professors and historians in the area, where we don't want to touch it. We don't want to deal with it. We did finally get the artist, an African-American muralist, to look at all the data and be like, oh, okay, yeah, I see how that could be offensive. And they changed the mural. So small victories, right? Small victories that we're able to get. But what we've done as part of the podcast is we're starting, we haven't started it yet, something called Atlantis Academy, because we learned that a lot of professors are using our podcast in their classrooms, and they're creating, study guides to go along with our podcast episodes. And so we're taking advantage of that. We're collecting all of this material from professors who are using them, and we're going to make them available free online so that other teachers can access them in their ethnic studies classes, right? Because we're not anti-ethnic studies. We're against teaching our history incorrectly and trivializing our history. So we do this where we've created, in addition to our podcast, we have a publishing house, we put out books, we do YouTube videos, we do Instagram videos, we've done a couple of documentary films. So we're putting all of this out there as a way to sort of counteract the misinformation and hopefully preserve what ethnic studies is supposed to be about and keep it on the right track, basically. So as part of that, and this is the sales part, if you guys want to support us, please check us out online. We take donations. We also sell books. We just put out this book called The Four Disagreements. It's a take on the book, The Four Agreements, the Toltec wisdom book, which is not Toltec wisdom, but it's letting go of magical thinking. And we've been sending these out for free to ethnic studies classes to hand out to their students. We also try to send them out to prisons and other places so that people have access to just how to think more critically and how to use scientific literacy and skeptical inquiry to get at the root of problems. So thank you. That is my short talk. Are there any questions?
So is this related to Afrocentrism, the whole part about pyramids and?
Yeah. So there's this really interesting thing happening online right now. So you have like the Afrocentrism of the 1950s and 1960s, right? Where they were really promoting this idea that, Africa and Egypt were, the sources of all world knowledge, that the Egyptians, that the Greeks stole all of their philosophy from Black Egyptians, and like there's all of these Afrocentric literature that came out of this era. And with the idea being that it was empowering for Black youth to hear these things. And it very well could have been, but if it's wrong, if it's inaccurate, like I think Black kids have enough to be proud of without making stuff up, right? But right now, what we're seeing online, and it's very small, but they're increasingly more hostile and vocal about it, is there's a movement, and they call themselves Aboriginalists. And they push this idea that who we know as Native Americans, that the native people of the Western Hemisphere are pretenders, that the native people are fake, that they're not really native people, and that this is a conspiracy, that this is a hoax perpetrated by they call us the so-called Native Americans and the white man, to hide the fact that the original Native Americans are Black people.
Wow.
And so it's becoming really, really hostile online, where the way that they approach Native people is like, I've been called a half-breed, Mongoloid, $5 Indian. They call us $5 Indians because they claim that we paid the government $5 to be recognized as Native people, and that we're hiding this history. And one of the most bizarre aspects of this Aboriginalist conspiracy is that the slave trade never happened. So they claim that slavery is a myth. And there's even memes that are like, where are the slave ships? If slavery was real, where are all the slave ships? How come we don't have any slave ships? And it's like hashtag, where are the slave ships? And so in their efforts to promote this bizarre racist idea, they're like even erasing African American history. They're like, all of this is fake, and we're the real Native people. Recently, groups of these individuals have gone to MMIW marches, murdered and missing Indigenous women's marches, and physically attacked the people there, saying that they're fake Indians. They'll show up to powwows and start fights, claiming that we're the real Native Americans, what you're doing is fake. And what's really insidious about it is I've seen some college professors start picking up on this and sort of like dropping hints that they support this idea and that this is something that they can get behind. It's not a lot. I'm not saying that it's like all these, but one or two is too many, in my opinion. And so, yeah, we refer to it as Afrocentrist extremism, but they don't like being called that because they don't even consider themselves Africans. They're like, no, we're Aboriginals. We're native from here. We are not Africans. We are not Black Africans. We are the original Black Native Americans. And so it's bizarre. Yes.
I just want to say that it'll never stop being funny that History Channel made an entire series called The Mayans.
Yeah.
All of that work happened without a single person having enough topic knowledge to even know that the title of their show was the most basic grammatical error.
Yeah, and I just got done working with Maya communities, and they were bugged by it. like I told them, like, how do you guys feel when they call you Mayan instead of Maya? They're like, man, that just pisses me off. And they said it in English because I was in Belize. So if you want to experience something unusual for me in a Central American country, is like having everybody speak English around you. It was pretty interesting. On off subject, but one thing that blew me away was the favorite movie in all of these Maya communities was Apocalypto. They love that movie. They love that movie. Archaeologists hate that movie, right? Historians hate that movie for all of its inaccuracies. But I would talk to the Maya men on my crew, Apocalypto. And I would talk to the men on my crew, and I'm like, really, you like this movie? And they're like, well, it's an action movie with Maya people in it. And I'm like, yeah, but they got all this wrong. And they're like, bro, it's a movie. Like, we know, yeah, they're like, we know it's wrong, but we're kicking ass in it. Like, it's an action movie with Maya heroes. And like, why wouldn't we love that? Also big on Namor, on Wakanda Forever. They're like, hearing these guys in the field like yelling, Liki Talokan. And I'm like, man, that's wild. But yeah,
Simple question first. Atlantean, is that specifically to Atlantis?
Yeah.
Not Atlantic regions?
Yeah, to Atlantis.
Atlanta, Georgia.
And I think maybe it was your revised UNM description that mentioned some scholars.
Yeah.
This work. Let's see. Is there any connection between those and the recent urban publication?
So, Ivan Van Sertima, definitely. Ivan Van Sertima. No. Ivan Van Sertima, I think his book came out in the 70s. It was called They Were Here Before Columbus, I think is the name of his book. And he really promoted this idea that the Olmec were either Black Africans or that the Olmec were Native Americans who worshipped Black Africans, and that the heads, the colossal heads, represented like the black gods that they had worshipped. So this individual, Ivan van Sertima, his work's long been discredited. He was using old, racist, outdated stuff from the 1800s to back up his claims. But Afrocentric extremists really glom onto his stuff because he was a college professor, he published a lot of books, he was very eloquent and well-spoken, so he carried this era of respectability and of authority, right? So when you see Ivan van Sertima brought up in any context, like your radar should go up and be like, oh man, this is probably some nonsense I'm about to hear. I'm not familiar with the other writer, with Jose Melgar, but Ivan van Sertima definitely has a long history tied into these movements. And the modern movements always draw from his work.
So I find it a little ironic, right, that Mexican Americans are also indigenous Native Americans, and now we're having our history kind of washed over, and so our Native Americans. Do you think it's because there's a little bit of shame to how historically our country has treated Native people?
Oh yeah, absolutely. When the Mexican-American War happened, right, and half of Mexico became part of the United States, one of the main reasons that New Mexico, it took so long for our state to become a state, was that they said that there were too many Indians here. And they were counting Mexicans as part of the Indian group. And they said, you know, what we're seeing right now is the greatest migration of Indians into the United States that we've ever seen, now that we've taken this part of Mexico, because now we've got this, they called it the Indian problem, because we just conquered an Indian country and took half their Indians. We hate Indians, so we want their land, but can we like get rid of them? And one of the ways they did this here in New Mexico specifically was they made it so rough to have any native blood. They made New Mexicans so ashamed that they created this narrative that New Mexicans are like direct descendants of Spaniards. That you'll hear a lot of New Mexicans say that. Well, I'm Spanish, I'm not Mexican. And I'm like, really, where in Spain were you born? They're like, well, you know, my 15th great grandmother was born in Spain. And I'm like, oh, okay, so you're obviously a direct descendant of Spain. But so yeah, there's a great book called The Language of Blood that goes directly into that self-shame and how it manifested itself in this identity of shame and anti-Mexican, anti-Indian sentiment in the United States.
I see a lot of northern New Mexico where my mom was from. Actually, they were Spaniard, but my father was Mexico from, parts of Mexico City, actually Torreon, Mexico. And my great-grandmother used to call him the Indian.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to make my mom really upset because she didn't want anything to do with Native Americans.
Yeah. And then now you have all these New Mexicans taking DNA tests and like freaking out, right?
Yeah, oh no, not Native. I loved it. I
Yeah.
it. It was really in my blood, so that I didn't have to.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, we have a couple of podcast episodes that directly address New Mexico in particular and how that carried out. Are there any other questions?
I got one quick question. What was Wickham's response? Obviously, they were given a chance to revise their piece to make it conform to, scholarship. They're like, no, thanks. But they must have had. So how did they reply to your criticism?
I was never able to find like a public response. So if they did respond, it was only amongst themselves, and then they rejected the opportunity to resubmit. So that's all we know, is they said, we're not gonna resubmit, and then 3 years later, they republished the same article in their book.
Bullshit!
So, yeah. I think that's
All right.
it. All right.
Thank you, Kurly. That was amazing talking to you.
James Randy, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. Someone's wrong on the internet, don't you know?